Here we go. Hi, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are and whenever you're watching this. This is Cathy Ammlung. You know me because I have done a lot of the intercessory prayers and the hymn suggestions, and I've also done some videos for Lutheran Core. In fact, one of the videos I'd done in the past was with my good friend and ordination sponsor, Tim Hubert. Hi, Tim.
Hi.
And we're going to do another one here for you today. And this one is on interim ministry. Both of us have done a lot of interim ministry in our career. And as a matter of fact, the church that we're doing this in is the church where Tim is currently doing his interim in Jeromesville, Ohio. So let's get started because this isn't about how to get an interim pastor. This isn't about a call process. This is about things like what can you expect during an interim? What are the different kinds of interim ministry? I'm going to call them flavors. You'll see why in a minute. And how you can maybe leverage the time that you're taking during an interim to get the most out of the experience and move you forward as you either seek for a new pastor or determine what your future is if you have a long-term interim. So let's get started. I wanted to introduce this because as Tim and I were talking, we realized that there's a lot of different kinds of interim situations. The one is what I'm going to call plain vanilla. Okay. All right. We're on an ice cream kick here. And the plain vanilla ice model of an interim is basically what I think most of us, when we experienced an interim in churches in the past, that it was sort of what was expected. And that was your pastor retired or left for another call or whatever. But there were no really serious issues that you were dealing with. You were probably a full-time or well compensated part-time congregation. And there was every reason to expect that you would have a new pastor within, say, a year at the most. Another kind of interim ministry, though, is what I would call the low fat, sugar free. And what I mean by that is you are in rather constricted circumstances. Maybe you have just very few people. Maybe your budget is very low. Possibly, along with this, you are in a more isolated environment or someplace where, it's going to be difficult to attract pastors. And it may be that there just aren't a lot of clergy available. In fact, even getting an interim might be very difficult. Along with that, it is usually the case that because of those like tighter circumstances, you might end up being in a long-term vacancy. And if there is an interim pastor, that person might be very, very part-time, but maybe there for a very, very long time. The third variety or flavor of interim that we're going to discuss is what I call rocky road. Now, that should be pretty self explanatory, but that rockiness, the bumps in the road, can be from a number of different causes. It might be that you have conflict in the parish. There may have been abuse or impropriety, not necessarily by the pastor, but maybe another trusted church leader, and it's just thrown everything into turmoil. Maybe there was a tragedy that led to a vacancy. I followed a situation where the pastor died of a heart attack on a cruise with his wife for their 25th anniversary. And, that really made for a complicated interim. There may be some significant changes in the direction of ministry that you're going to take. Possibly you're trying to decide if you're going to, expand your ministry, do a church plant or something like that. You may be in a building program or considering one. There may be some other thing that is a good challenge and some good bumps in the road, but that still necessitates some really serious thought during an interim. Now, Tim, I'm going to put you on the spot and say, are there any other forms of interims that you think if we've got time, we should maybe discuss?
Well, we probably should look at what happens. You've talked about congregations that don't have much money.
Mm-hmm.
It's even more of a problem if they have a ton of money.
And so they've got maybe an endowment that allows them to continue in existence, but because of their numbers or other circumstances, they're really not on a growth trajectory.
Right.
And getting a new pastor, even though they may have the money for it, is still going to be a
Yep.
challenge. I'm not quite sure what flavor that is, but oh, I don't know. Soy tutti frutti? I don't know. Come on. If we get to that, because I was in a situation that wasn't exactly like
Mm.
that, but that did teach me some things. And uh, there, in fact, one interim that I was just in had that kind of a situation where they had a fair endowment and they were trying to figure out how to use it wisely, realizing that they might otherwise be out of existence. And they were going to eventually need to close. They wanted to do it in style. So God bless them. But all right. Um, let's talk first about maybe the expectations that congregations have of interim pastors and the interim situation as a whole. They're going to have some good expectations and maybe some that are unreasonable. Can you speak to both that you've seen in your experience?
Well, my experience, let me go there first. I'm currently in my 12th
Oy.
interim,
Yeah, you've been around the block a few times.
and all varieties that you've mentioned so far. What a congregation looks for in an interim is somebody that keeps the doors open,
Hmm.
meets the spiritual needs of the congregation, visits the hospital, visits the sick in bed at home, um, does the funerals, does the confirmations,
Hmm.
the usual pastoral stuff.
Hmm.
They are somewhat confused when an interim comes in because they always wonder, could this be the next pastor?
Ah, uh,
And the more you look like the next pastor,
the more they want you as their next
the
pastor.
next pastor, and that takes real discipline
Hmm.
to not let that happen.
Hmm. Because it's not common that I remember when I started interim ministry, you weren't allowed to, if you were the interim, to continue as the next pastor. That worked against me when
Mm.
I came in as a called pastor. They probably should have kept their interim. And then it worked for me when I was at a large congregation and they did what I called the lease with option to purchase
Ah,
program,
yes.
where I was the interim pastor. Then they like voted for a 2-year term call and then another one. And then they voted to keep me. So I was there like 9 years as the first interim and then the associate pastor. And that worked out very, very well. But in many cases, I don't know if it's that, when people are in an interim, they start feeling a little desperate and a little scared. And better the devil they know than, some fly by night who, they don't know anything about. At least they know your quirks at this point. But yeah, that's actually an unreasonable expectation to think that that's going to be your next pastor.
Right.
Now, the caveat, and we'll get to that in a little bit, is in that low fat, sugar free variety where you have a long term vacancy and the prospects for being, for calling another pastor are slim. You still might end up at the congregation as their de facto pastor for several years. I was at one church for 4. You've been in places, and I know where you're serving now. The previous pastor, as the interim, was here for 16 years,
Yep.
longer than any of the called pastors. So, go figure. But so let's just say that it's a reasonable expectation to say that an interim pastor needs to take care of the basics
Yeah. Hmm.
and that the interim pastor is probably not going to be your next pastor,
No.
but in that special circumstance, it might be there for a while because uh, that's just the reality. But let's focus on what your expectations of being an interim pastor in a congregation are. What are the general things, regardless of whether it's rocky road or plain vanilla? What are the expectations of your interim going in that you want to make clear to people?
Well, when I come into a new congregation, one of the first things I say to the council in particular, and I also put it in the newsletter, in pastor's comments, is that an interim is, in my experience, is usually 12 to 18 months.
Okay.
Now, how that is divided up between just getting to know the
Mm-hmm.
congregation and knowing what they need and what they're looking for, or how much they need to heal,
Mm-hmm.
that can be 6 months of just getting
Assessment almost.
assessment and a year looking, or a year of looking or of assessing and 6 months of looking.
Mm-hmm.
Or I've been places where it's been 2 years, even longer, because they needed so much healing,
Mm-hmm.
and they knew they needed so much healing.
Mm-hmm. That brings me to a question, because my experience as an interim has been that most congregations, whether they're plain vanilla or rocky road, and sometimes even that sugar-free, low-fat variety, they are gung-ho to start the call process. They want to start like the day before yesterday, and they're not always ready. And how do you help them to assess what needs to happen before they begin the call process, and why?
Well, I tell them when I come in that I can be very helpful in getting them ready to call a new pastor, but I need time just to get to know who they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's usually helpful, because anytime you're even a consultant or something, you
Mm-hmm.
actually need to get to know your client before you're able to make reasonable suggestions. And frankly, considering how many times, if it's done too quickly, the next called pastor becomes the de facto interim.
That's what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, you want to actually make your interim, and the next pastor, the next called pastor. So when you are in, let's start with the easiest variety of
Mm-hmm.
thing, and that's the plain vanilla, where there really aren't that many problems, and they're just sort of chugging along and saying, okay, we know what we're doing, we're calling our next pastor, been through this a few times, we kind of know what to expect. Is this generally, as an interim, a just go and get just keep things going kind of ministry, or are there changes to the life and worship and ministry that are appropriate to be addressing and possibly changing, even though it is an interim?
It's getting harder and harder to find plain vanilla
That's true.
parishes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They tend to fall in one of the latter two almost
Yeah.
by default. And that's, I guess, maybe that what that tells people is maybe they're not as plain vanilla as they thought they were. And not because they're bad people or there was a problem, but because, the circumstances, even in the church, have changed, where it's more difficult to find
Mm-hmm.
pastors, and the resources you need can really be rather great. And in many denominations, the size of our churches has decreased. And so there's a lot of reasons to suspect that plain vanilla is not as plain as we think it is. How should the interim pastor and the call committee interact with each other, even in a plain vanilla setting? But we can talk about other settings, as we move forward. But what's a healthy relationship?
I always offer, when a call committee is established,
Mm-hmm.
and I suggest that it's not established for a little while, just so I can know the congregation and know what to help with.
Mm-hmm.
But once the call committee is established, I offer that I can help them if they want me to help them.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't want me to help them, I will stay out of the process.
Mm-hmm. Do you still, even if you stay out of the process, intend that they should keep you somewhat informed about like where they are in the process, so that you have some sense of gauging even the dynamics of what you're doing in a parish?
That kind of depends on how dysfunctional they are.
Oh, okay. Take that for what it's worth, folks. Okay. What do you mean?
Some call committees will keep the communication open. Some call committees want to be very, very secretive,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't tell anybody, not even the congregation,
Where they are in the
where they are
process.
in the process.
Yeah, and whether that's good or bad, it probably depends on the actual setting. I've seen, I've been to congregations where, the call committee at least gives a generic update as to where they are in the process and stuff like that. And, it seems to be pretty helpful. But
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's each to their own, as they say. Um, let's move on because that's probably the case for a lot of churches, and that is the long-term vacancies, what I call the low-fat, sugar-free. Often these are very part-time on the part of the interim pastor. It could be something like Sunday morning and, one day a week for visitation, etc., stuff like that. How does that change your priorities as an interim pastor, and how should the congregation's expectations, be modified?
The concept of a part-time pastor
Well, yeah.
is something of a misnomer.
Yes, your hours are truncated. How's
The hours you're paid for
that? Yeah. All right. Yeah, I'll
are
buy that one.
truncated.
Yeah.
The number of hours you actually work is usually 2 or 3 times as much.
Yeah. Yeah. Which really begs the question, though, because it really, whether you look at it as compensation or just the fact that, really compared to a lot of interims, your time is limited with them. And, especially because churches like this may be calling upon someone who's at quite a distance.
Mm-hmm.
You've experienced that. I've experienced that. That, you really want to make the most of the compensated hours. How can the congregation and the pastor work together to leverage that time and make it as effective as possible?
Well, that's when the council becomes very important.
How so?
The council needs to be aware of what's going on in the congregation,
Hmm.
the pastoral need in the congregation, and to be in communication with the interim.
Okay,
Yes,
you're getting just a little
groggy,
gravelly.
groggy there. I haven't had my coffee yet.
All
I
right.
haven't had my pot.
Oh, of coffee, folks, of coffee. Moving right along.
But that's when the council needs to work very closely with the pastor to make sure that all the bases are being covered.
Okay, so that means, there are a lot of things that people assume or that go without saying, and they need to get said.
They need to get said.
And a lot of that is going to be things like, okay, who needs a visit? What's the situation with a family that might have some special things? But also, what are some other things that the council really needs to keep you apprised of, in terms of the nuts and bolts working that are really important? Because I know you're involved with things like worship planning and, just the, gosh, we've got to do something with the insurance or the parking lot or the roof or whatever. So what are some of the things that they really need to keep you in the loop on?
Well, that is kind of depending on the particular
Right.
congregation.
Yeah.
Some congregations are very independent of the pastor, and some work very closely with the pastor.
Hmm.
As the interim, you need to figure that out.
Okay. Okay.
If the congregation council wants to work with the pastor, then that's the best of all possible
Hmm.
situations because everyone learns
Hmm.
in that situation.
Hmm. Yeah, and because it also means that if there are some things that you want to introduce into that
Mm-hmm.
parish, that they're part of that, and
Right.
they can even give you some of the history and say, we tried something like that with Pastor so and so. It didn't
Exactly.
work well. Might be worth revisiting, but here's what happened, so that you at least know where the landmines are and
Exactly.
maybe kind of, skirt around them. What kinds of things, whether they be, training classes for the leadership of that kind of a
Mm-hmm.
congregation, let's say, whether it be as a worship assistant or a lay leader or a lay visitor, Eucharistic minister, etc., or classes for the parish at large, what kind of things can an interim pastor do and maybe even initiate for the first time that will help that church to weather, maybe even thrive during what might be a time otherwise of, apparent stagnation?
Well, again, this is when the communication between the pastor and the council needs to be close and worked out, so that the pastor can recommend things like this
Uh-huh.
and get the feedback on, is this a good idea in this location,
Right.
and is it a good idea at this time?
Hmm. And also to say who might be a person that, would have the interest and
Yeah,
the passion for doing something, especially when it comes to visitation.
yeah,
Because a lot of times, in a small church, and especially when an interim is at a distance, you know that you want to be at the hospital or, at somebody's home when there's a crisis, but you may not be able to get there until the next day or two.
hmm,
And therefore, you need to know, okay, who are the people that we can count on? And, just as a stupid example, a phone tree that actually like includes you,
yes,
but that also reminds people that just because you told your cousin who told their sister-in-law who told thus and so person, um, did anybody think to call the pastor? I almost had someone actually die, and I would have walked into church that Sunday morning, fat, dumb, and happy, and not have known that she had taken a sudden turn for the worse, been, transported, and died overnight. Finally, somebody did let me know, but, you know, people don't always realize because they have an informal network. And especially if it's a small church, isolated, and a long term vacancy, they're
hmm,
used to getting along on their own.
right.
And so, to, like you say, intentionally work with the pastor and say, it's not the family's immediate responsibility to call Pastor Tim. They're busy dealing with their sick loved one. Maybe the sister in law or the cousin or the best friend could say, hey, Susie Q, would you like me to call the pastor?
And interims, especially at the
Yeah.
beginning of the interim time, this is very uncommon.
Hmm.
Um, we're just not remembered.
That's right, because it's hard to kind of get you into the loop as being the
Yeah,
pastor,
yeah.
even if you are an interim. Good point. Um, with these kind of congregations, is there a way to help them to avoid just treading water or stagnating and possibly, in the best of all possible worlds, maybe even considering a call process, or if not, at least putting into place something that will make a smooth transition to their next long-term interim?
Ooh, that's the thought.
Yeah. Just I know that was a complex question, so you can answer any part of it.
Okay. No, the more time you can meet with people, meet with the groups in the congregations, and understand how the dynamics work within that congregation, what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses,
Hmm.
uh, that allows the interim to talk to the council and say, uh, this is what I see.
Hmm.
Is this what you see?
Hmm.
And that is a good conversation.
Hmm.
And if we can come to an agreement, then we know that we're getting closer and closer to the time to begin a call committee.
I see. One of the things that, especially in these smaller congregations that are often aging, often don't see themselves as having a mission future, they're not going to, get out there and, you know, do huge tasks or anything, that I've always tried to, impress on them. And I know that especially with your passion for prayer, and, just as a plug for your book, The Short Course on Prayer, which was, by the way, the topic of our last conversation together, that a prayer ministry is incredibly important because, as I've told people in different congregations, just because you quote unquote can't get to church or you can't do what you used to do, doesn't mean you're useless or a failure or of no importance. And certainly the church isn't, but that you have a task and a time that maybe other people don't, and that is to not only hold the pastor and the members and the committees and the leadership of the church in prayer, but, other prayer needs as well, your community, some specific group. You look at the prayer petitions in the intercessory prayers, just a plug for them, that I send out. I'm always praying for the church throughout the world, your local congregation, the persecuted church, those whose work is difficult and dangerous, such as first responders and military, our government, elected, appointed, and community leaders, specific needs based on the day of the church, and for all the faithful. And so, take one of those petitions every day or every week and use it in prayer, and to
Mm-hmm.
intentionally create a ministry of prayer, or as we see in Jeromesville, gathering shoeboxes
Mm-hmm.
for something like Samaritan's Purse,
Right.
or other ministries that they can assemble healthcare kits or backpack kits, or the shoeboxes. That is yet a ministry that will touch the hearts of many, and especially if they add a personalized note, because they've got the time to do it. That this is important, other people may not have the time, and for them to say, I can use this time to do ministry, is a way to keep them from stagnating as such, and certainly from despairing.
And not only in Jeromesville, but in several congregations that I know of, a lot of that reaching out stopped during COVID,
Oh yeah.
and things that they used to do before COVID are no longer there.
Mm-hmm.
So now they have to reinvent themselves,
And they're 5 years older.
and they're 5 years older.
Yeah.
And that's where the interim can be very helpful.
Yeah, and to remind them that life hasn't stopped just because COVID threw a monkey wrench in everybody's plans, and that's really important, especially for these long-term vacancy type churches, is to realize that they're not dead yet. Come on, folks, you've got a lot of life and a lot of ministry to do, and even if you only have an interim for a day or two a week, that if you work with that person cooperatively, you're going to find that there is a lot that God has for you to do, and it may be rather unexpected. Let's spend some time, because we spent a lot of time on these others, and of course we did. But the most challenging kind of interim, I'm sure, is the what I call rocky road ministry, and that arises from different sorts. Before we get too much into that, this is probably where having someone who's been trained in intentional interim ministry can be extremely valuable. You've gone through some of that training. Can you at least talk a little bit about what's involved in it and how that can benefit a congregation?
The basic concept of intentional ministry is to keep clear who you are and who they are. You are intentionally helping them to see what they can't see.
Okay. We just had a little screen bloop, so if we looked like we couldn't see what we couldn't see, that's why.
I was ABD in consulting psych,
Uh-huh.
and that gives me an advantage in intentional ministry
Mm-hmm.
because I took all the abnormal psych.
All right, what are you telling these poor people? Abnormal psychology was a really good help. All right, what do you mean by that? That's not going to be completely off-putting to our gentle audience here.
Okay, I stepped in it, didn't I?
Yeah, you stepped on a rake there.
No. There's a reality that we all struggle to be normal, some more than others.
Yes.
And the more training you get as an interim to recognize maladaptive behavior,
Okay.
the more you can reach out and be helpful in those situations.
Okay. In other words, a lot of times people get in really kind of ruts of behavior and habits, and they don't even realize they're in it. And unfortunately, they may not realize they're in it, but they're really good at it. And that can be very hurtful to themselves, to other people, to the ministry of the church, and the witness of the church to the larger community. So those are the sorts of things that you have to kind of be aware of and be the non-anxious presence to be able to help them see, name, and work through some of those things.
Yeah, the intentional interim especially needs to keep separate who they are, because some people want to use the interim um, for their own purposes, and because they understand the interim isn't going to be there long, they have to work quickly, and they're just doing what they've always done.
Mm-hmm. But it's more intense.
But it's more intense.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
You just have to be able to recognize what's going on and love them anyway.
What is the most important thing that you do with or say to a Rocky Road type interim congregation when you first begin?
Well, the first thing I look for is who are the people that are causing the pain in the congregation. Then I'm looking to see who are the peacemakers.
Okay.
And generally, there aren't many peacemakers, and there are a lot more.
Troublemaker. Oh, come on now.
Well, at least one troublemaker.
Yeah.
But the lack of peacemakers, that's interesting. So that's again where you work with the council and starting to train the council how to be peacemakers.
And that's different from what a lot of congregations and leadership want to do, which is either kick the can down the road to the next pastor and or to paper it over and pretend that nothing bad has happened, or to placate and to give a troublemaker perhaps more
Power and authority.
right. And so being a peacemaker is actually a very active rather than a passive role. And it also takes some courage.
It takes a lot of courage.
And so working with people to be genuine peacemakers is, well, you see why it's one of the Beatitudes, I suppose, but what are ways that you can help encourage people to be peacemakers? Because what I'm thinking of is that also may help congregations before things get out of hand to begin doing a little of that themselves. It makes your job easier, right? But what are some things that you would encourage as peacemaking tasks or ways of being in a Rocky Road parish?
Peacemaking in a congregation can be done by anyone. It involves listening.
Okay.
Not necessarily agreeing, but listening. Because that's what malcontents really want.
Is to be heard.
Is to be heard. Now, some malcontents go further than that.
Yeah, let's not go there right now. But, let's stick with the peacemaking.
Yeah. Peacemaking is to be a friend.
So you're talking about relationships.
Yeah.
I know that in one church, one of the main things that you ended up doing that was very significant was actually reinstituting staff meetings and having the staff actually work together peaceably and cooperatively. How does that, get played out in the church as a whole?
Well, that was a larger congregation, and that had multiple staff, and that really worked wonders. And so the pastor that eventually came is having a wonderful time there.
Excellent.
Smaller congregations don't have as many resources to do that sort of thing.
So there you're talking about peacemaking perhaps within the council.
Yeah.
And the, what I would call the acknowledged leadership.
Right.
And the acknowledged leadership is not always the council,
No.
There are often gatekeepers or authority figures that you need to hopefully be able to develop a relationship with and cultivate something that they can maybe model something healthy for the rest of the congregation. How do you do that?
One person at a time.
Which is fair to say. In other words, it's not like there's some special program out there,
No, no.
magic that's out there that
There,
you just go
there's
through this course and boom, you've got a happy, healthy congregation again.
no healing takes time,
Mm-hmm.
and some people respond faster than others,
Mm-hmm.
and you just have to sort that out.
So, one thing that people who may not have ever thought of themselves as either influential or peacemakers, and peacemakers can be influential, but is that they need to start thinking about truly cultivating intentional, healthy
Yes,
relationships. And you're there to,
encourage them,
encourage, model,
model.
and help them practice it.
Yes,
Okay, folks. So this is, what's, and that I think is regardless of what kind of rocky road. In fact, everything you've talked about, even in the long-term interim situations, is really about relationships,
it is.
listening, and I keep I keep thinking that Jesus took only 12 disciples. It's not like he didn't start with a sorry, Billy Graham, but he didn't start with a Billy Graham crusade. He started with 12 people that he worked behind the scenes, so to speak, and talked with them, modeled things, showed them, kind of made relationships the basis of what
Mhm.
he was doing, and then said, by the way, I don't have a plan B. You're it. Now go. And it sounds very much like what an interim is doing is taking some of that, regardless of the flavor of interim, but that relationships and modeling good Christ-centered relationships that are based on patience, grace, forgiveness, listening. Anything else?
Well, before we go further,
Yeah,
it needs to be said, not every interim is going to be successful,
that's true. I was in one that was not.
and that is not a failure necessarily of you. It's a failure of the relationship.
Yeah, and in the situation I was in, I just had too many things that were. I had I was with a group of interim pastors, and one guy said, I've been doing interim ministry for 30 years, and I've seen everything you've talked about,
Oh yeah,
but I haven't seen it in one parish in 1 year. All at the same time. He said, I wouldn't touch that congregation with a 10-foot pole.
there are those
Yeah.
congregations.
And I mean, it just happened. They were good people, but they just had too many things that were in some ways not even related to one to the other. And it was just like things just kept hitting us
Yeah.
and we couldn't duck fast enough. And that was tough. But we left on good terms. So,
Yeah.
that was what we could say. But regardless of how bumpy the situation is, that kind of congregation will often also want to start a call process
Hmm.
faster.
Oh yeah.
And why, first of all, why is that? But how do you help them to slow down and do the painful and hard work of working through stuff rather than, making the next pastor, as I say, the designated de facto interim?
Well, again, this is why it's important to work with the council, because it's the council that establishes the call committee.
Okay.
So if you work with the council and uh, just keep that conversation going where you see the needs of the congregation,
Mm-hmm.
what needs to be healed, what needs to be pulled back, what needs to be pushed forward, that sort of thing, and say that this is why I'm here,
Mm-hmm.
to help you see these things and give you time to get ready to call a new pastor.
Mm-hmm.
But that's going to take some time from
Mm-hmm.
now.
And what there's a saying in the military: slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And I think what in this situation it means that if you do that necessary groundwork, that
Yeah,
once they're ready
once they're
to
ready.
call, then they can pretty much go full speed ahead
Yep.
because they've taken care of. They kind of know where they are, who they are, and to a degree what they're going to need. And then of course you pray like crazy that there will be a pastor out there who agrees and is able to answer that call. But We've almost gone on 40 minutes here, which
Oh
is
my.
a little bit longer than we should have, but is there anything else, any words of wisdom that you would impart?
The basic role of an interim pastor is to love the people that you're serving, and in any loving relationship, good boundaries are important.
Okay. So good relationships, modeling good relationships includes boundaries, peacemaking, and listening.
Yeah.
All right. I think on that note, we can leave. Thank you very much for staying tuned for all this time. God bless you. We'll see you again.
Amen.